So, bonjour toutes, mesdames et messieurs. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to another round of the CSPC virtual series. We are getting into the final rounds of the virtual sessions. There will be two more, one in September and one in October, and then we will start pre-conference sessions of the CSPC 2020 on November 4th. But today, we want to talk about science communication, and our guest is Anton Holland, President of NIVA Communications. Welcome, Anton, to our session.
Hello, and it's a pleasure to be partaking in this today.
Thank you. Let me just tell you a little bit of background about Anton. I squeezed actually his CV quite a lot. But Anton is NIVA's president and CEO. He has led the company's science and risk communication practice. He has a background in aquatic ecology, but later he became a science communicator. Having created NIVA's science and risk communication practice, Anton now has almost 3 decades of professional experience as a writer, knowledge broker, and communication consultant. A few career highlights include leading the writing team that developed the crash investigation report for Swiss Air Flight 111 in conjunction with the Transportation Safety Board of Canada. The report broke new ground with respect to finding innovative ways to communicate large amounts of very technical information to diverse audiences that have little or no technical background. More recently, he served on the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change Expert Review Committee for the upcoming SIST assessment report on climate change, with a focus on providing advice for communicating climate change messages to different audiences. Anton has a deep passion for ocean science and conservation and is an advisory council member for Canadian Ocean Literacy Coalition. And welcome to our show, Anton, and great to have you here with us today.
Thank you very much, Murda.
Anton, I must say that he's all-time friend and supporter of CSPC, and we really appreciate your collaboration with us over the course of last few years.
Yeah, it's always a pleasure.
Thank you. Okay, so first, let me ask you about the definition of science communication in your view as an expert, and communication of science with whom and for what purpose?
All right. Well, science communication covers a lot of ground, so it's important to consider it within the context in which it's being performed. So at a very basic level, many people see science communication as simply translating the jargon of science into language the public understands. Plain language is important, of course, but it goes far beyond that, especially in the environment we find ourselves right now with COVID-19. In our practice, we find ways to interpret what's being said at a scientific level, make that content understandable to whatever audience is being targeted, and I think this part is critical, link that to things that are important to the audiences to whom those messages are being delivered, right? So the potential audiences are wide and varied. And that means science communication serves a number of purposes. For example, we could be talking about getting important health-oriented information into the hands of the people who set the policies that keep us safe. Or in fact, raising the alarm over a situation that may seem distant and unnoteworthy to the uninitiated, but is of great concern to those in the know. And we're hearing, about that kind of thing this week with respect to GFIN. We're hearing that in the news. There's a chain of people in that whole ecosystem, not all of whom are scientists or who have science backgrounds. So it's essential that information is conveyed to them in a manner that helps them understand both the gravity of the situation and the possible choices that are at their disposal. Now, we could also be talking about public health messaging surrounding COVID-19 that's directed at members of the public. One example of this early on was the challenge of communicating not just that hand washing is important, but what makes it so effective and a better activity than some other intervention. Now we're thinking about, why do vaccines take a long time to come online? And why is that actually better for us in the long run in terms of safety and effectiveness? So to that point, science communication is sometimes not just about the science itself, but the process of carrying out science, which in many ways is not intuitively obvious to people on the sidelines. And then a related practice is science communication's much more complicated cousin, risk communication. That's where information is provided to enable people at risk to take informed decisions to protect themselves. So you can see the relationship there with science communication. It's complicated because people generally have a hard time understanding the concept of risk, and communicators generally have a hard time communicating about risk meaningfully. It not only needs to communicate the facts about risk in a given situation, it also needs to take into account the actual concerns of the public, which may not necessarily have anything to do with the actual risk or the science behind the situation. Much of the interaction with members of the public in a risk communication scenario surrounds dealing with emotion-based responses. But that in itself has a huge impact on the receptivity of an audience to the risk messaging that's being delivered. So there needs to be a significant focus on empathy and dialogue in those cases.
And so you mentioned, you explained my second question about its importance during the public health crisis, for example, and it's important. And but could you tell us about, beyond just, you mentioned about the behaviors, but in terms of the decision making overall for, let's say, the decision makers, why it's important to have a proper science communication strategy during the pandemic, especially for decision makers?
Well, as we've seen in the past, and with this current crisis, many countries struggle to manage public health emergencies. And a big part of that is basically a failure to communicate appropriately, from scientists to policymakers, between levels of government, among health professionals, with the media, and to the public. And really, the point of all this communication is building and maintaining public trust in science, and as a result, maintaining high levels of public support for control measures. At various points along the timeline of the crisis, we've dealt with instituting a lockdown and physical distancing to slow the spread. We've debated the efficacy of wearing masks, and now we're juggling the desire to reopen the economy with the need to help keep the spread under control. So from that perspective, and what you mentioned in terms of decision makers, science communication has an essential role during a public health crisis. Without effective science and risk communication at each of these stages, we run the risk of erosion of that public trust. And this is especially true when it comes to measures that may be perceived as challenging personal privacy, like the use of contact tracing apps. And on top of all of that, sorry?
No, go ahead, please. That's interesting.
Yeah, on top of all of that, information's coming at us from all directions. Right. It's difficult to separate the good from the bad when we're getting, sprayed with a fire hose of information. And the WHO, in fact, coined the term infodemic to describe that. And there are often many conflicting sources of that information. So what it really boils down to, and I'm not dramatic when I say this, is that effective science communication during a pandemic is literally a matter of life or death. And guidance from the US Centers for Disease Control and Prevention sum this up by saying, during an emergency, the right message from the right person at the right time can save lives. And science communication in that context helps craft the right message.
So you shared some of your observations during the COVID-19, for example, pandemic, which is extremely important in this case. I want to ask you about the mixed messages, not necessarily mixed messages, but different messages that are changing from the authorities. What is your opinion about that? For example, just covering the faces with mask, use of mask, face masks. some at the beginning, as authorities mentioned that this may be helpful, and then they may not be helpful, but then they change, their message. What is, as an expert in science communication, what are your observations? What are your take from this changing messages?
Right. So those of us who come to this from a science background, right, we recognize that as new data and information becomes apparent, right, we may rethink our positions on something and change course if necessary. And what I had mentioned earlier about science communication also serving a role in communicating the process of science, that's key, because someone on the sidelines, someone who's not trained as a scientist, they may look at the change in guidance as A, flip-flopping, B, that the public health officials don't know what they're doing and they're getting bad advice from scientists. And what's even worse is that perhaps scientists are lying to us, right? And so then we see the interjection of misinformation and disinformation here. And so what needs to be done is, take advantage of the opportunity to really be clear about how science works. Let people understand that there is a process involved, and that in fact, the fact that information is changing is actually a good thing. A lot of people come to view science as being, the decisions are immutable, right? The scientist has made a proclamation and this is the way it's going to be now. That's a very rigid point of view. I think we can take advantage of that and let people know that the very fact that things are changing is actually to our advantage and helps with our well-being.
Interesting. So for that, those you have just joined us, we're talking to Anton Holland about the science communication and communication of risk. And in a moment, in perhaps 2-3 minutes, we will open up the conversation and Q&A for participants to ask their questions. Please use the Q&A box in the bottom of the Zoom screen, Zoom window on your laptop or devices, and write your questions and we will read them to Anton. So Anton, I want to have another question. Could you talk about some of the key challenges facing organizations as they try to communicate this subject matter to really very diverse audiences that have different needs, different levels of understanding, and perceptions? What do you think about that?
Yeah. Well, I think, I briefly introduced that whole issue of misinformation and disinformation. And I think that's going to continue to be a problem as the pandemic wears on and people become more troubled about their physical and economic well-being. I mean, it's hard to counter an erroneous simple message when the correct one is more complex. But we're seeing some movement there. Social media platforms are starting to address it as well. So there is some support on that front. But I don't think that the situation can truly be rectified unless public health organizations are relentless in taking a much more direct approach to putting out the right information at the right time in ways that ensure the broadest possible audience can understand it. I think we're no longer just dealing with public health authorities communicating to citizens about the pandemic. There are much broader issues at play now. Organizations at large need to communicate clearly to their employees, right? Stress levels, both personal and professional, related to working during the pandemic are on the rise. So organizations need to be extremely mindful about how they are responding to that. Now, is there an integrated communication strategy in place to ensure that sentiments throughout the entire organization are aligned? Keeping fluid communication between leaders and employees will be important and key in ensuring that is successful. And another thing, we hear the word unprecedented being used a lot during the pandemic. So I think at this point, I think we get it. Yes, things are unprecedented, but it's time to move away from that type of thinking, at least in terms of appropriately communicating during the crisis. I mean, there are tools at our disposal to get this done right. Tools that have proven to be effective. And one thing that we've seen throughout this crisis is that there is always a new issue or idea that bubbles up and needs to be addressed. And many times it seems that organizations have been a little blindsided and the issues seemingly cropped up without warning. I think something that organizations should try to do is gain a little advanced knowledge on what the next issue will be. I mean, no one has a crystal ball, but some forward planning on communication strategies can be done. A detailed analysis of the possible areas of concern can be carried out fairly quickly if you apply the right expertise, and that will enable organizations to have at least some base preparation and get information out to the public and other audiences much quicker while still ensuring accuracy.
Excellent. Okay, thank you, Anton. So we have a number of questions coming up. Please feel free to vote up a question if you like and write your question in the Q&A box in the bottom of the Zoom screen. And before I go to the questions from the audience, I want to ask my colleagues at the CSPC to share first question from CSPC to the audience, to the participants, and please take a second to respond to that question, which always help us to adjust our programs within the CSPC. We want to know which sector you're coming from, and I appreciate your response to that. So, and my advance apologies, by the way, if I mispronounce any name, apologies for that. The first question is from Nathan Holwell. What, in your opinion, is a major drawback in the current news system that prevents the public from receiving effective science risk communication?
Well, I think one drawback is that when an erroneous message gets out there, right, that it is reported on, but then it continues to be reported on repeatedly, right? And so one problem there is normally our reaction to seeing something erroneous is to counter it with a fact, but we address the erroneous message first and then provide the fact. That actually has been shown to backfire because it reinforces the erroneous message. So what's happening is, by addressing it that way, you're building up strength for that message, and the counter message that you're providing is kind of drowned out by that. And to some extent, I think the media is doing that, not because they're trying to support the erroneous message, but there's a need to be complete in their reporting. But then so the erroneous message continues to be repeated, and then it's followed up by the corrections. But the opportunity has been lost there.
Okay. The second question is by Lee Geller. It's about vaccines. Once there is a vaccine, what would be the approach to clearly communicate the importance and value of vaccines, especially considering the anti-vax movement?
Well, the anti-vax problem is one that's pretty pernicious. But as we have found with anti-vaxxers in general, not just with respect to the COVID-19 situation, is that if we show some empathy when dealing with people who have views that may be counter to what we're thinking in terms of a scientific basis, and we show that we're trying to understand what their concerns are, that people who hold those views will be more receptive to the countervailing view that, in fact, these things are beneficial to them. I think in a lot of cases, people like anti-vaxxers. I mean, there are some pretty hardcore anti-vaxxers that are pushing an agenda, but there are a lot of people who are concerned and worried, and in a vacuum of information, they glom onto something that is simple. And an anti-vax message can be fairly simple when compared to the one put out by health officials about why vaccines are important. I think, you know, those approaches have been showing some success in reaching the anti-vax group. And I think, you know, those things can be applied with respect to the COVID-19 situation. You know, lately, I think some polls have been showing that in general, the general populace is supportive of a vaccine and taking scientific approaches to this. So, you know, we may be able to end up with the vaccine-induced herd immunity, irrespective of the fact that there are, you know, anti-vaxxers out there as well.
Okay. Question from Yuji Cheng. What are your practices to build trust when communicating information with our new norms?
Well, I think in any situation where we're trying to build trust, it's really not just about communication. We've been throwing the word communication around a lot. It's more about dialogue, right? We need to have a two-way kind of communication process. You know, it's always important to understand an audience, right, and not make assumptions about what an audience needs and wants and is concerned about. So it is important in that kind of situation, trying to build trust, to understand you know, what the audience is concerned about, and a dialogue does that. And then, of course, not just carrying out a dialogue for the sake of saying that you did it, but actually, you know, responding to the information that you receive in a way that takes into account their concerns.
Okay, so a question from Sarah Laframbois, and I hope I did not mispronounce your name. My apologies for that, if I did. Do you feel that social media should be held accountable for the spread of misinformation on its platforms? It's a tough one for you, Anton. If so, how would you regulate this privately or at the government level, that you would still ensure freedom of speech? That's a very good one and tough one, Anton. That put you in trouble.
Yeah.
Your Twitter account will be, make sure that it's not be closed.
Well, my personal view is 100% social media platforms should be held accountable. You know, they're providing the means for misinformation and disinformation to spread, right? You know, free speech is one thing, but there are consequences to what we put out there and what we say. And if a platform is promoting things that, at the end of the day, are harmful to individuals and to society at large, you know, then those platforms need to be held accountable to that. A mechanism for that, I mean, I think that's up to smarter people than me to figure that out, because I think that's a bit of a minefield. But you know, we have to have some honest discussions about that, and move that forward. But I really do think that, you know, social media platforms do have you know, a role to play in being accountable. And I think some measures are being taken so far, but I think there's probably a lot more that can be done.
Okay, that's good. So I want to ask my colleagues at CSPC to launch the second question about, I believe this is about the region that you're coming from and participating in this session. We appreciate your response to that. So the next question is, let me see, about from Justin Souls, is with respect to your comments about mask usage. I'm curious whether one of the issues is that the idea of scientific discovery, and in particular the idea that you change your ideas based on new data, is misunderstood, perhaps badly, by the general public. Can you elaborate on that, Anton?
Yeah, it absolutely is. I mean, there are a lot of things that that occur in sort of the in the scientific milieu that may not make sense to people who are not part of that or have not ever touched that, right? Um, if we want to look at a different example, we can think of the way that the word theory is used in a scientific basis versus the way it's used in common parlance, right? And those two meanings in those two worlds, in some ways, are polar opposites, right? I mean, a theory in science is something that you're challenging and you're constantly trying to work on developing. And in everyday use, a theory is just somebody's idea, right? And that's not something that everyone would want to trust. So yeah, absolutely. There are things within the scientific process that people don't understand, and as I mentioned a little bit earlier in one of the questions you had asked, Meredith, I think there's an opportunity there to address that fact. Now that so many questions are coming at us so quickly, one thing about this whole crisis is that it's really opening the doors to a lot of things with respect to the science, the results of science, how science is conducted, what it means for people, and why it's important to us. So, we really have kind of an important opportunity right now that we should take advantage of.
Okay, so the next question by Jane Gilbert. You spoke about trying to get a handle on the next issue. Can you look into the crystal ball? What do you see as the emerging issues we should be thinking about? Very hypothetical question. Anton, if there is anything into your mind.
Yeah, well, I think one of them will be, and this has just come to play, just recently, I guess it was yesterday, where we hear that, one of the phase 3 trials has been paused because of an adverse event, right? That's going to start happening more frequently because there are so many, candidates out there. There are many that will be moving to phase 3 trials, and as things come up like that, I think people will start to be a little concerned about the safety of vaccines when they hear that there are these adverse events, right, that are happening. So the opportunity there now is to really talk about how the fact that there was an adverse event, the phase 3 trial was paused, they're reassessing things, that's actually a good thing. And that whole process works to our advantage and our safety, and that's the mechanism working properly. There are going to be mistakes, and things will have to be reassessed at some point. But if we leave that in a vacuum, there was an adverse event, the phase 3 trial was paused, again, we leave the door open. There's a void that's going to be filled by misinformation and disinformation, and we have to get on top of that right away, and get the right messages out very quickly so that that void isn't established, and that in fact the right message is the one that has primacy over the misinformation that will come after instead of before.
Right. Another question is about some of the politicians, people with authority, who have made some comments which may not necessarily were scientifically accurate from across different countries. And what are your thoughts on those when these individuals with authority making some comments which is not necessarily based on science or maybe represent some false information? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, those situations are extremely unfortunate. People trust, people trust politicians to a greater or lesser extent, and in certain countries, that more so or less so. And so when someone that the general populace is looking up to makes a comment of that nature, that can do real harm to progress on a public health basis. However, people do think independently, and they are able to make their own conclusions about those types of things. But yeah, it is a problem, and short of some kind of countervailing, opinion from another source that has equal trust among a populace, it can be a real problem. Yeah, I mean, we see that in some of the countries where the crisis is not being managed well. It's because those types of messages are held at the top, and people are going along with that.
Right. So before going to the last question, I want to make sure that people know about our next virtual session, which is titled Canada's R&D Innovation System in a Post-COVID-19 World. It is an analysis of economic review by Dave Waters, and the presentation includes the impact of priorities announced in the speech from the throne, which announced the day before of the session. The session also has two discussants, Karen Young and Irene Sterian. This session will be on Thursday, September 24th at 1 p.m. and the link will be posted by my colleagues in the chat line. Please make sure you mark it down and be present. Also, I want to ask my colleagues at CSPC to launch the third and the final question for participants. Tell us how you like this session and rank us on that basis. So Anton, the follow-up question by Justin Soul, sorry. I agree with you on the need for an organization to implement some level of foresight with respect to their COVID communication strategy. But would you use some foresight tools? What would we use? Some foresight tools, approaches, scenarios, or would you have some tips or advice for someone involved in this?
Well, I don't think I'm proposing anything radical here. I think as communicators, I mean, we're trained to take a look at what some of the risk areas are going to be in terms of what an organization is doing with respect to communication. I think we need to work closely with experts in the field to understand what some of those possible things are that are coming down the road. And if we have those types of dialogues, then as communicators, we can be prepared for what might potentially be the next issue that comes down. So I think we really have to rely on the expertise of science and be scientists and be able to interpret what they're providing to us. And of course, when we do develop the approaches and messages to really validate that with the scientists to make sure that we're doing a proper job of presenting it.
Excellent. That's great. Thank you very much, Anton Holland, for your insights and comments on this. Before giving you the final word, I want to remind participants that the program of the CSPC 2020 is now posted online. Please take a look. My colleagues posted the link on the chat line. It's an exceptional program with 80 panel sessions, more than 300 speakers, and significantly reduced registration fees. And please take a look and use the early bird registration fee and register yourself. Anton Holland, President of NIVA Communications, thank you very much for being with us and share your insights. The last word goes to you.
Okay, great. Well, I think that the COVID-19 pandemic reminds us very starkly of how much we depend on science and scientific expertise for findings to solutions to really hard problems, the really serious challenges that we face. And I think it also highlights that there is an invaluable role for science communicators who are able to empower people with relevant, timely, and clear messages that help to navigate their lives during an extremely challenging time. There's a tip from the marketing world that if you don't write your own narrative, someone else will. I think public health organizations and other related organizations, need to coordinate their messaging, need to broadcast it repeatedly at high volume with every tool at their disposal. We need to drown out the noise of misinformation and get ahead of the problem rather than just reacting to it.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Anton Holland. This brings us to the end of this session, and we'll see you, everyone, on September 24th at 1 p.m. And have a wonderful afternoon and day. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.